thank you to tragedyandhope.com for hosting this. And thank you to all the people out there for tuning in for this conversation. I have no doubt it's going to be a stimulating debate. And tonight, as Richard mentioned, we are talking about the question, is government by its very nature immoral? And to debate this question, we have two people who you may or may not be familiar with, so let's introduce them one by one. And rather than me belaboring an introduction, why don't I allow them to introduce themselves in one sentence or less? So first up, we will talk to Tom Wilcuts, who is a practicing attorney and also a member of the Tragedy and Hope Forum, where you can find some of his writings on these topics. Tom, thank you for joining us. Tell us one interesting thing about yourself.
I think probably the thing that gives me the most experience to talk about this that I have myself is that some of my principal cases are against Wall Street. So they're sort of a major player on the government scene, and I have that experience. Other than that, a degree in philosophy and physics in college, so that helps a little bit, I think. So we'll see.
All right, and next we have, on the other side of this debate, we have Stephan Molyneux, the host of freedomainradio.com and a general man about town. Steph, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Would you like to say one sentence about yourself before we begin?
All right, it's going to be a pretty run-on sentence, but I'll do my best. Well, of course, it's Stephan Molyneux, host of Free Domain Radio. I have a master's in history, focusing on the history of philosophy, and I run the biggest, most popular philosophy show in the world with over 50 million downloads, and I'm enormously pleased to have a chance to have this conversation, and thank you so much to the host moderators and to Tom.
All right, excellent. Well, let's begin the debate. Once again, the question being debated, is government by its very nature immoral? And arguing on the affirmative side of that it is immoral, is going to be Stephan, and on the negative side, Tom will be arguing against that idea. So we have decided that Tom will go first, and Stephan will follow. I will be timing this, and we will not be particularly strict with the timing, so I will simply ask the speaker to start wrapping up their statements once he reaches the 10-minute mark. And when I say begin, you can begin. So Tom, take it away. You may begin when you are ready.
Thanks, James. As I understand it, there are two principal arguments that anarchists make to demonstrate that government is inherently immoral. One of these arguments is presented as sort of a logical proof based upon reasoning alone. The other argument is an empirical argument that is based upon reviewing the historical facts. I'm going to address both of these arguments tonight, and I will start with the first one that attempts to use reason and logic alone to demonstrate that government is inherently immoral. One obvious flaw in such a claim is that government is a thing or a tool. It is not a moral actor. To say that governments are inherently evil or immoral is like saying that guns are inherently evil or immoral. Although over the course of history, both governments and guns have been used to do many immoral and evil things, it is not these tools themselves that are immoral. If a person uses a gun to commit a crime, it does not make sense to say that the gun somehow was morally responsible for that crime. The gun is merely a tool. A person who wields that tool can use it for an immoral purpose, such as a crime, or the gun can be used for a moral purpose, such as protecting the innocent. The same is true for governments. A government may be used for an immoral purpose, such as oppression, but may also be used for moral purposes such as resisting oppression. You will find both examples during the course of history. In the case of guns, Stephan understands that if you unilaterally give up guns, then you are at the mercy of those who retain them and can use them against you. The same holds true for government. Government is an organizational tool that is potentially powerful depending upon the strength of its organizational structure. Magna Carta was the beginning of an ongoing struggle that continues today as between the propensity for government to become oppressive and the efforts to keep that from happening. Now, what the anarchists in effect advocate is that this struggle should be abandoned, that we throw in the towel and simply admit and accept that government is a force beyond the ability of the people to control. So one problem I see with Stephan's position and the anarchists in general is that, on the one hand, they see government as this evil force and we just need to get rid of it. On the other hand, there's a lack of an analysis of who is behind this government and what happens to the people who are ruling it if you simply get rid of it. My contention would be that the real power behind the government is the multinational corporations.
10 minutes, please wrap up your statement.
Sure. And there's a lot of evidence of that. And if you don't address that power, you simply eliminate the government and don't address the power that's behind it, the power wielding that tool, then you're not really solving or addressing the problem.
All right, thank you for that, Tom. And let's go to Stephan for his opening comments. Stephan, when you start speaking, I'll start the timer. You have 10 minutes.
Well, the first thing I would suggest to the people who are listening to this debate is that the way that I learned how to debate way back in the day in college was to start by definitions. Now, Tom put forward some, I think, faulty analogies. The government is like a gun. My love is like a red, red rose. But what I would argue is that we need to begin with precision. We need to begin with definition. So there are three main things that need to be defined in this conversation. The first is, what is a government? I mean, the problem is if you think you know something when you don't, then you will always go astray. If you think that you're looking at a compass and you're actually looking at a whirligig, you're not going to go the right direction in the woods. So what is a government? The second thing that needs to be defined is morality, specifically good and evil. Because if we're saying that the government is or is not evil, we need to know what the government is, we need to know what good is, and we need to know what evil is. Then we can make a comparison. And people who put forward analogies prior to definitions are usually up to something fairly tricky. So please check that you still have your wallets and your watches on your persons. So I will provide the definitions that should have been provided already. The first is the government is a group of individuals who possess the legal right to initiate force in a given geographical area. Let me say that again to make sure it sinks in. I don't think this is a particularly unusual definition. It's not, pulled out of some left field. Barack Obama has said the government is force. So the government is a group of individuals with the legal right, in fact, the obligation to initiate force in a given geographical area. So that's what a government is. Now, as far as good and evil goes, obviously that's a very, very big conversation. And so I'll just touch on it very briefly here. I think that most of us will accept that the initiation of force is immoral. That's, I think, pretty essential. Violations of property rights are just a different way of initiating force. Now, you may disagree with that, but the reality is that these are things that the government bans in its legal structure. Almost all governments across the world and throughout history have banned these kinds of things. So, for instance, they have banned they have banned the initiation of force, and they have banned violations of property rights. So what we can say is that the people who inhabit the government themselves view the initiation of force as immoral, and themselves view violations of property rights as immoral. So by the government's own standards, by the legal framework's own standards, by the legal precedents that Tom is mentioning, the initiation of force and violations of property rights are immoral. And if they're not immoral, then the government is immoral for enforcing them. So there's no way to make the government moral if these things are moral or immoral, because the government enforces them. If the government enforces the non-aggression principle and the government violates the non-aggression principle, then the government is immoral. If the government enforces a respect for property rights and then the government violates the negation of property rights, then the government is, by definition, immoral. So if we accept that the violations of non-aggression principle and property rights are immoral, then the government is, by definition, immoral. I would certainly reject the idea that the government is like a tool. You could say, well, the government is just a relationship. Well, the government is just an abstraction. Well, sure. But slavery is just an abstraction. Slavery is just a relationship. Rape is an abstract category. The act of raping is a relationship between an assaulter and his victim. So we are, of course, speaking of a category in the same way that we're speaking of a category called murderers. Now, murderers, of course, is an abstract category, but it describes a specific relationship which violates the non-aggression principle. In the same way, yes, of course, government is an abstract concept and government is a relationship, but government is human beings acting. Government is human beings acting, and that is very different from a gun. A gun is an inert object. It is a thing, of course, as Tom so perceptively points out, but it is not a thing acting. So recently, of course, in Cyprus, the government decided to hoover out between 7 and 10% of people's bank accounts. I know that there are some very well-sophisticated, well-equipped guns with laser sights, and they have scopes and all that kind of stuff. But there's no gun that I know of that will wander into a bank and take 7 to 10% of your income. That is the choice of individuals acting under the concept called government. Now, concepts, of course, don't particularly exist, Plato notwithstanding, and so when we sort of wrap human beings in this concept called a government, it's just creating an artificial category, like creating slave master and slave is creating an artificial category. They're all human beings. The people in the government are human beings. Calling yourself the government doesn't give you the chance to fly. It doesn't let you breathe underwater. It doesn't let you enjoy Justin Bieber songs. It doesn't actually allow you to do any things which are generally impossible to human beings. But it does create an alternative moral category. So if you go into the government, if you call yourself the government, then suddenly you're able to violate people's property rights by initiating the use of force in the form of taxation, in the form of regulation, in the form of warfare, in the form of national debts. You're allowed to counterfeit, which is specifically banned for individuals. You're allowed to print whatever money that you want. You are allowed to create these magical evil entities called corporations, which are legal fictions created by governments for the purposes of hoovering in and grabbing the financial classes to their own evil chests so that they will continue to get loans. It's a way of artificially taxing people by pretending you're taxing something called a corporation, when in fact there are only people who get taxed one way or another. So sure, corporations are bad. Governments are by definition evil since they initiate the use of force. That is their very definition. Their very definition is that they violate property rights. And all of their actions are specifically banned to everybody not in this magic bubble called government, and who gets thrown in jail for doing exactly what the government does, for counterfeiting, for I cannot say to Tom, I bought a car and signed your name to it, so I can't enforce some third-party contract he wasn't part of, but the government can through something called a social contract, which is just an imaginary deal with a very real devil. So I reject that any moral claim which is supposed to be universal, which is then reversed for a particular group of individuals, is a valid moral claim. So if the government says, well, the initiation of force is wrong, you go to jail if you do it. Counterfeiting is wrong. Entering people into contracts against their will is immoral, and so on. But that's the very definition of what the government does. Then, of course, the government, by its very own definition, is immoral. And it is not an abstract thing. It is a very real, guns-to-the-neck relationship to the citizens. And it is not an inert thing. It is not a tool. It is a relationship that violates the very moral principles that it claims to uphold. And thus, by definition, it must be immoral. And I know I've only gone 7 and change, but I think that's really all I had to say for the intro.
All right, yielding back the time. Okay, thank you for that, Stephan. So let's move on to the rebuttals. Again, we have 2 rounds of rebuttals, 5 minutes each. We'll start with Tom's first rebuttal, and when you begin speaking, I'll begin the timer.
Okay, thank you. Well, where I would start off is with Stephan's statement that corporations are a creation of government. I mean, insofar as governments have a role with corporations coming into existence, it's simply that they require corporations to register and provide them essentially a license. But there's nothing about a corporation that requires the existence of government. This is because a corporation is just a series of contract rights. See, there's absolutely no need for there to be an existence of the government to have a corporation. And moreover, if you did away with government, you certainly would not be doing away with corporations. And if Stephan thinks otherwise, I'd like to hear him explain how that's going to happen. There's a quote from, I'm going to read from a former president of Colombia and winner of a Nobel Peace Prize about corporations. And a corporation, like a government, is an organizational tool. And that's a problem. You get rid of the people's access to an organizational tool, and the people's access is government. They're going to have no organization to counter the power of corporations, which is an organization that will survive removing the government, and they will have to deal with. Nicholas Murray Butler, I weigh my words when I say that in my judgment, the limited liability corporation is the greatest single discovery of modern times, whether you judge it by its social, by its ethical, by its industrial, or in the long run, after we understand it, know how to use it, by its political effects. Even steam and electricity are far less important than a limited liability corporation, and they would be reduced to comparative impotence without it. So another point to be made is, listening to Stephan talk about the society that he would like to put in place, he's not doing away with authority. He's not doing away with the legal system or the right to use force. What he is doing is just substituting a new system. And this is one of corporate contracts, where corporate contracts now become the new law, and corporate arbitration becomes the new court system. And the idea that the free market can provide checks and balances on that power is, in my view, in my opinion, if you studied it, if you've had the experiences I've had, I think that's just simply delusional. So I'm sure we'll speak more about that. I'll drop it there rather than start a new thought.
All right. Okay. Thank you. And let's move on to Steph. Your first rebuttal. When you begin speaking, we'll start the timer.
Well, I'd like to rebut, but I don't feel like I was rebutted. I mean, I put forward a definition of the state, which was not addressed. I put forward a definition of good and evil, which was not addressed. And so I guess I'll deal with what Tom was saying, but I would invite him either to quibble with the definition or to quibble with the definitions of good and evil, the state or good and evil, because otherwise the proposition that the state is evil is proved logically. Anyway, so yeah, corporations, of course. I mean, contracts, you can contract for whatever you want in a truly free market, in a voluntary society. And there may be limited liability companies in a free market. Who knows? I mean, it's impossible to know how society is going to self-organize in the absence of a central coercive monopoly. And that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what happens in the future after we identify and begin to dismantle the immoral power of the state. It's like saying, how will the cotton be picked 100 years after slavery? Well, who knows and who cares? The question before us is slavery immoral? Is statism immoral? If statism is immoral, then we don't care about the consequences. Of course, corporations have a certain amount of power at the moment, of course. If you compare it to the power of the state, it's inconsequential. Corporations do not have nuclear weapons. Corporations do not have aircraft carriers. They do not have a prison industrial complex stretching the length and breadth of the land. They don't have the capacity to indoctrinate children for 12 years of their existence. They don't have the capacity to tax at will. They don't have the capacity to counterfeit and print money at will. These are all powers held by the state. Now, corporations, of course, because this power exists, have responsibility to shareholders, to bondholders, to employees, to customers, to make use of this power. Because if they don't, somebody else is going to. So once this power is loose in the world, then corporations, by the natural laws of what's left of the free market, are going to be drawn to use this power for economic advantage. Otherwise, they're going to go out of business and not be able to succeed. And I know this as a guy who was a software entrepreneur for 15 years. And if we did not take tax breaks that came from R&D tax credits, if we never looked at any possible government contracts, we simply would have gone out of business. So, of course, when you get this corruption in the center of society, corporations are going to donate massive amounts of money to politicians in return for political favors, economic favors, contract favors later on. Of course, no question. But the point that Tom didn't mention, which I think is quite important, is you don't want to blend economic power together with political power. You don't want to put together, to sort of commingle the power. That's like commingling marriage and rape. This is completely wrong. A large, we'll call them corporations. I think, free market companies is probably a better term, but we can call them corporations. A large corporation may have a good deal of economic clout. And how do they get that economic clout in a free market? By satisfying their customers. If they start doing things the customers don't like, guess what the customers are going to do? They're going to stop doing business with that corporation. And so if people don't want a corporation bullying and throwing its weight around and so on, then they'll just boycott, stop doing business with that corporation. And this is very regular. So the only economic power that a company has in a free market is the approval of its customers. And if it begins doing things the customers don't like, then the customers will simply stop doing business with that corporation, which everybody at the head of that corporation is fully aware of. And so corporations will have to avoid doing things wrong. What happens when the government stops doing things that the people approve of? Well, Nothing in particular. The approval rating of Congress is 6%. Is Congress changing its course in any fundamental way? No, of course not. Because they can print money, because they can steal money at will, because they can start wars at will, because they can imprison virtually at will. I mean, what is it? 96, 97% of all convictions are based upon threatening people with massive jail sentences unless they just cop a plea to whatever comes their way. So, no, I mean, there's no justice, no fairness, no virtue in the existing system, which is exactly what you would expect for an immoral system. It's really, really important to recognize the difference between voluntarism and force, and I call anyone who's sophist who commingles these two concepts.
I will assume you're yielding your 4 seconds of time. Okay, and let's move on to Tom. Your second rebuttal, 5 minutes.
This notion that government acts for its own ends and does all these bad things, like one example that's often discussed is war. To demonstrate, to get to the facts and demonstrate that the government is just being used as a tool for the people who have the interest in engaging in such wars, have an economic interest in engaging in such wars, we can just look to the comments of General Smedley Butler, who was a career Marine who rose to the highest level of the Marine Corps. And after he was finished and retired and looked back, he commented upon what it is he did in the foreign ventures that he was involved in. And I'm going to quote General Butler. Quote, "I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped the raping of a half dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. And China in 1927, I helped to see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested." So then the question becomes, these large multinational companies, if you remove government, are they all of a sudden going to stop using force and coercion to get their way? I mean, they're doing it now, clearly. So if you want to say that by removing that single tool, they will stop doing it, I think you have a burden of coming forward with evidence to suggest that. So under the anarchist society setup, now you have what they call DROs that either work with a security force agency in an arbitration group, or they may combine into a single entity. And one of the things these DROs can do, if someone breaks a contract, they will decide who broke the contract, and then they will, if necessary, exercise force to uphold the rights of the contract. So all you need to imagine when you listen to General Butler, imagine in the modern day scenario, you have Hugo Chavez down in Venezuela sitting on all that oil. I know he died recently, but so imagine when he was alive, Venezuela certainly didn't develop all that oil. I'm sure there were, and I don't know all the particulars, but typically the oil companies are involved in doing that. So all these oil companies have to do in this system, now that they're not constrained by government, is to say they breached their they breached their contracts with us. They damaged our property rights. They took control of things that we built, that by the homesteading principle we developed and we owned. We've tried to negotiate with them. We've done everything possible. They can use their corporate media to get across that PR message. And now that we've tried everything and it hasn't worked, we're going to use our private defense association to go down there and recover our property. And what might that private defense association be comprised of? Do the names Halliburton, General Dynamics, Blackwater, Kroll Associates, companies like that sound familiar? In the absence of government, these companies could simply, they're not going to just shut their doors. There's no reason to. They could simply merge and take care of this. Now, the question is, well, wait a minute, isn't war expensive? Would they do this? I mean, first of all, there's no more corporate taxes. There's a study that shows that you can fund the military on corporate taxes alone, so that's sort of a wash. Also, you're not bribing politicians anymore and running the government in that respect. But in any case, it doesn't matter because the Venezuelan oil is more than going to pay for this venture. You no longer have to explain why you're going into a democratic country and why you're using American men to do that. History shows that the American people would not accept that. But now that you're under this corporate paradigm, you can simply say they broke this contract paradigm. They broke their contract. They usurped our property rights. We have the right to go in there and do this. And so there's how war continues in this new society.
Thank you. Let's move to Steph. Your second rebuttal, 5 minutes.
Well, again, we're not. I'm not really having the chance to address any rebuttals to my arguments. I mean, we have a rambling discourse which has nothing to do with anything that I said. So, once again, we have to define government. We have to define good and evil if we're going to come to some sort of resolution about this. But to respond to what Tom was saying, I've read the Smedley Butler article in one of my shows, and what is essential to understand about that is the mechanism by which all of these predations through the corporations was achieved, which is the centralized coercive capacity of the state. The corporations all try to gain the power of the state to inflict their own economic agenda where they don't or can't compete in the free market, or where competition in the free market becomes impossible because someone's going to grab that gun or not. And so the idea that these corporations are going to make their own armies and they're going to just go and get, this is crazy. And this is just not what happens in the real world. The reality of being able to print money, of having an existing army that can be used, of having an existing police force that can be used to do all these terrible things, that is the violence that is in the room that is going to attempt to be controlled by corporations. In the absence of that, they're not all going to develop their own armies because it's a massive overhead. I mean, just imagine. Okay, so imagine you're Standard Oil and you want to go and take some of your competitors' gas stations. Well, you're going to have to start buying an army and training an army. That's going to add to your overhead. And your shareholders are going to be aware of it. And they're going to say, wait a minute, I don't want you guys to have an army. And you're going to have to start raising the prices of your gas to pay for this army that you're developing, it's going to be all over the internet. So these corporations are not going to develop their own armies because they're going to have to raise their prices to pay for these armies. It's going to be completely evident to everyone that these armies are being raised. And of course, it creates an arms race among all these different corporations, which is going to be financially impossible. And none of the customers are going to want it. So the customers are going to stop doing business with anyone who's developing an army. Now, there will, of course, possibly be armies or defense agencies in a free society. And the first question that any entrepreneur who wants to sell a defense agency contract to any group of people, the first question that entrepreneur is going to have to answer is, well, why should I give you a thin dime? Because maybe you'll just turn around and become another government. So they're going to have to show people, and they're going to have to prove to people to the best of their ability how they're going to guarantee that they're not going to turn into another state. So, I don't know exactly how that's going to happen. No individual can replicate the genius of the free market, millions or billions of people interacting to their best potential benefit. One possibility is, I promise to tell you every single bullet and every single person that I'm training, every bullet I'm buying, every person I'm training, every shell that I'm buying, and make sure that I don't buy one thing more, and I'm going to put $50 million in a third-party trust, and if anyone finds me buying more bullets than I say, then I'll give them $50 million. There's lots of things you can do to make these kinds of arrangements with people. And if anybody tries to buy hidden stuff, then they're going to have to raise prices to deal with it, and that's going to be a market signal that they're doing something nefarious and so on. So that's all possible. As far as the use of coercion goes, I think it is possible that coercion may be used in a free society. Certainly self-defense is a valid concept in a free society. If someone's running at you with 3 lightsabers and a chainsaw, you can use violence in terms of self-defense. In terms of contract, I imagine what's going to be the case is insurance, because insurance is a lot cheaper than having people armed and going out and shooting people. And violence is very much going to be a last resort. And violence will be very much a last resort in a free society. And what I think will be much more common will be economic ostracism. which means that nobody will do business with you in terms of selling you groceries, delivering electricity, delivering water, or anything like that until you make restitution for whatever wrong you've done. And I think ostracism is a much more peaceful, much safer, and very much more effective way of bringing people back in line with general social ethics than having a bunch of armed people running around with the ability to violate property rights and personhood at will. So, yeah, there's lots of different ways that these things can be solved. Nobody can guess how it's actually going to work. But what we do know is that the initiation of force is immoral. Government is defined as the agency which initiates force. Therefore, the government is immoral.
All right, that brings us to the conclusion of the rebuttal rounds, so we move into the question rounds. In this round, I will ask the question at a specific person, but after that person answers, the other person will have a chance to make a comment on the answer as well. So let's start with the question for Tom. Stephan has raised the point that he has provided a definition for government in tonight's debate, but it seems that so far you have provided only an analogy about government being a tool or being a gun or other analogies like that. What would you say positively as your definition for government?
I actually looked that up once. I mean, the idea that government has a monopoly over initiating force. I mean, I never heard that definition until very recently. So it's a relatively obscure definition. I don't think you'll find it in the top 5 in any dictionary. But what I would say, James, is that whatever that is supposed to mean, it's not a difference between government and the society that Stephan is supposing. I mean, this anarcho society. So, I don't know if that answers your question. These DROs would have the same right to initiate force that government has. There's no conceptual distinction to be made from these two systems in that regard.
Well, I mean, Tom neither disagreed with nor agreed with the definition. He just said it was non-standard in ways that are unspecified. That is intellectually lazy, to be perfectly frank. I mean, you can either find a logical fault with the definition or you can't. I mean, just to say, well, it's not in the top 5 that I've heard of and then just move on. Well, what on earth does that mean? I mean, either it's accurate that they have the legal right to initiate force in a geographical area or it's not. If it's not, then please enlighten me. And if it is, then accept the definition. So this kind of stuff is, wandering off into other things. I mean, okay, so let's say that the existing arbitration system is not great. Okay, fantastic. What a wonderful opportunity in a free market system for people to solve this problem. Is it possible for them to solve the problem in the existing system? Well, clearly not. I don't know why. I guarantee you there's some government regulation or some government monopoly that stands in the way. But what a wonderful opportunity. I mean, if I was in a free market system and there was a need for this kind of arbitration, then I would say, look, I am going to not get paid by the corporations. I'm not going to get paid by the individuals. I'm going to take 50-50 pay from either of them to make sure I don't favor one or the other. I mean, there's just so many different ways that you can approach this to find a way of solving it. You have reputation systems, you have arbitration systems. None of them involve force. None of them involve law. None of them involve courts. Because the only person who imagines that you can get any kind of justice or access to the legal system is somebody who generally hasn't tried it or a lawyer. I mean, certainly in the past, when I had a legal issue, I could either go to private arbitration, which I could get done quickly, or, as my lawyer informed me, I could try to go to court, which would take me about $250,000 and probably 8 to 10 years was his estimate. If you look at the law courts in terms of family law and so on, I mean, it's just completely ridiculous how slow, how inefficient, how ridiculously expensive it all is. And so if you are a company that regularly rips off its customers, that information with the power of the web and the power of the media will be available to just about everyone, in the same way that if you decide to order from someone on eBay or PayPal who has a really bad rating, you know in advance what kind of risk you're taking and you're likely to steer away from that kind of person. Contract rating agencies, personal integrity rating agencies, credit rating agencies not controlled by the government as they are now will be all over the place. And so if you make bad decisions, maybe you'll be able to rip off 1 or 2 people, and maybe those people won't be able to get restitution from you. Maybe they'll have insurance from someone else. Who knows? But the reality is that your actions will very quickly become known, and the economic price you will pay for your lack of integrity will be much greater over the long run than what you can possibly make from ripping off a few people. All of these things are in effect now.
Stephan, your question for Tom.
Well, I guess I would question if we accept, even if he rejects the definition that I put forward of the state, does he recognize that the state bans people from doing what the state claims is its moral right? So, for instance, I can't go to my neighbor and demand a percentage of their property value so I can send my kid to school, but governments can. That I can't go and slap tariffs on goods coming in and take the money and do other things with it. Whether they be good or bad things doesn't really matter. Tom, do you at least recognize that the government specifically bans that which it explicitly permits for itself?
Sure. I mean, but, the problem with that, Stephan, again, I mean, saying all corporations or all governments are bad or good or all corporate, I mean, you could have a charitable corporation that does nothing but charitable deeds. And on the other end, you can have Blackwater and Halliburton. So, I mean,
who take government money?
Well, I don't think it matters. I think that, look, I think they would be happy to take Standard Oil money as well, financed by Citigroup. But
yeah, but Standard Oil would not require them to fund the invasion and slaughter of the Iraqis, right? I mean, this is not what would be in their business plan. I mean, the fact that they take government money, you can't just commingle those with people who have voluntary customers.
I'm not sure I understood your point there. I mean, look, so in terms of the real question is, I would agree with you that there shouldn't be coercive taxation. I would agree with you that there shouldn't be compulsory public education. So to say that, well, that's like saying I would agree with you that, the Nazis shouldn't have abused their people. As an evil state, were they able to do that? Yeah, of course, yes.
Okay, well, we will stop the question time there, and we will move on to the concluding remarks. Once again, each speaker will have 5 minutes to make a final statement, and we'll start with Tom.
I'm going to address this issue of insurance because it is a fundamental part of, it seems like any anarchist who talks about this alternate legal system. We're going to solve all these problems with insurance. I really am wondering whether there's anyone in this anarchist movement that has any practical experience at all with insurance, because I do. I have nearly 30 years of litigation experience, including with Wall Street. When I listen to the anarchists imagine how they're going to completely redo society, I can't help but thinking of the Marxists. I mean, they had a great idea. I mean, they saw oppressors in the capitalist and the industrial age, and they said, these guys are evil people. If we just get rid of them, everything will be fine. Those kind of simplistic solutions almost never work. The anarchists, they look at government, they go, these are really abusive people. If we just get rid of them, everything will magically be fine. But you have to look at the people behind government, and this is simply what the anarchists don't do. The people behind government are the large corporations. That was actually the finish of my sentence.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and let's move on to Stephan. 5 minutes for your concluding remarks.
Well, gosh, I'll just touch on some of the, I think, very silly things that Tom said. First of all, he said that insurance companies are the worst serial abusers of contract. Well, of course, you vote for people who tell you what they're going to do, and then they do the complete opposite. There's no capacity. You have no capacity to enforce your contract with the politician you vote for. They can go and do whatever the hell they want after you vote from them. In the 20th century alone, governments killed 250 million people. I think that the worst serial abusers of contract tend to be governments. He said that insurance companies deny every single claim, and that this is a bad thing. One little Google search here. Medicare denies more claims than private companies. Medicare denies 6.85 percentage points of insurance claims from people. The denial rate of private insurance is about 2.7%. So, of course, he's got a view of insurance companies that comes from fighting them, which, of course, I can understand that insurance companies do some bad things. But it is still almost 3 times better than governments, the people he wants to put his trust into. And so a couple other things where he mentioned that, Steph just doesn't like public schools. I mean, what a ridiculous misinterpretation of absolutely everything that I've said. My personal preferences, my personal likes, my personal dislikes, my personal imaginations about how a system might work are completely irrelevant. They're interesting thought experiments. I think they're fun to look at. We can all imagine how cotton are going to get picked 100 years after the slaves are freed if we're sitting around in 1800 drinking mint juleps and pretending to be Tennessee Williams characters. But the reality is that the central objection has still not been addressed. We've had lots of back and forth, lots of misinformation, lots of avoidances of definitions, and lots of avoiding rebuttals. The reality is that governments are, by their very nature, as Tom admitted, violators of their own universal claims of moral goodness, right? So they say that the initiation of force is wrong, and they violate that very principle through their very existence. This was admitted by Tom. So, I mean, I don't know how you can continue to wind around like smoke in a high breeze and talk about various things that just aren't true or relevant when you've admitted the basic thing, which is that governments claim that the initiation of force is wrong. They claim that violations of property rights are wrong, and their very existence, as you yourself admits, violates both of those moral principles. Violations of both those moral principles for private citizens is the very definition of immorality, is the very definition of evil. Violations for people who claim to be the government, who have no substantive physical, emotional, psychological, biological differences from those they claim to rule over, are exactly the same as the people are people wherever you go. It doesn't matter whether they put funny hats, tea cozies on their heads, or whether they wrap themselves in anacondas and lie on a bearskin rug. It doesn't matter. They're still people. And so you cannot give, morally, a group of individuals the right, the capacity, the obligation to initiate the use of force against their fellow citizens and call it moral. If it's evil for the private citizen, it is evil for the government, because the government is just another private citizen with a slightly different label and no substantive difference whatsoever in any moral sense. So I think that the anarchist position, like it or not, has really carried the day, but I certainly do thank you for the interaction.